there exists within the vast, often uncharted territory of the human experience a whisper, a resonance so subtle, so deeply embedded beneath the clamor of our daily lives that it often goes entirely unheard, or if fleetingly perceived, is swiftly dismissed. It is an almost subaudible, yet profoundly persistent and ultimately undeniable tremor that vibrates beneath the meticulously constructed, culturally reinforced tectonic plates of our perceivable, consensus realities. This is not the sudden spectacular cataclysm of a world irrevocably undone before our horrified eyes, nor is it the blinding instantaneous and often disruptive illumination that can sometimes follow a psyche-shattering spiritual revelation or a profound, unbidden mystical experience. Instead, it manifests as a slow, insidious, almost imperceptible drift, the silent, relentless creep of an invisible psychic tide drawing us with patient, inexorable, and often tragically unconscious force away from the sacred, life-giving shoreline of our own intrinsic, inviolable, and utterly unique truth. We find ourselves often at the meridian of our lives, or perhaps even in what should be the vibrant spring of our youth, standing as the ostensibly successful, often lauded, architects of elaborate, complex, and socially validated existences. These are lives meticulously designed according to inherited blueprints, externally benchmarked for worth, and frequently admired, even envied, by the collective gaze that we have been conditioned to perceive as the ultimate arbiter of our value. Yet, within the gilded, often surprisingly hollow, cages of these hard-won accomplishments, these accumulated trophies of conformity, we are increasingly, undeniably, and often in a state of profound, unspoken isolation, haunted by a pervasive, deeply unsettling sense of inner alienation, of being a stranger in our own skin, a tourist in our own life. The external foundations, the career, the relationships, the possessions, the social standing may appear robust, unshakable even. The accolades, degrees, and recognitions may fill shelves, adorn walls, and inflate resumes, testifying to a life of apparent achievement. But the inner sanctum, the heart's own inviolate, sacred chamber, the seat of the soul, too often echoes with a quiet, unyielding, profoundly resonant desolation, a silent scream in an empty cathedral. This is not the stark, clean, pregnant emptiness that might follow the dramatic, liberating rending of a veil of illusion, an emptiness that invites new creation. Rather, it is the insidious, creeping, chronic hollowing born from a long, sorrowful, and often entirely unacknowledged lineage of 1,000 perhaps, 10,000 perhaps, countless tiny, almost invisible yet cumulatively devastating surrenders. The self-betrayals enacted with such numb, habitual regularity that they become normalized, invisible, mistaken for prudence, for maturity, for compromise, for love. These are the betrayals committed daily, hourly, in the desperate, often unconscious, and ultimately futile pursuit of conditional acceptance, in the fraught, soul-eroding bartering for a fleeting, unreliable sense of perceived safety, in the tragic, pervasive illusion of a love that, by its very nature, demands we be anything, absolutely anything, other than what we truly, authentically, and divinely are. What precisely occurs with such devastating, often lifelong subtlety, when the innate compass, that exquisitely calibrated, divinely issued, and inherently trustworthy instrument of the soul that you were unequivocally, miraculously born with, specifically and perfectly designed to orient you, in every moment, towards your unique, unrepeatable, and sacred true north, is systematically, degree by silent, almost imperceptible, yet powerfully cumulative degree, recalibrated, distorted, interfered with, and ultimately, tragically, overridden and ignored? It is influenced, not necessarily by overt, identifiable malice or conscious, nefarious conspiracy, but far more commonly by the overwhelming, often inescapable, and deeply internalized magnetic pull of external expectation. It is swayed by the unexamined, inherited weight of familial legacies, unspoken loyalties, and unconscious transgenerational traumas. It is shaped by the pervasive, deeply embedded, and often contradictory cultural scripts that relentlessly dictate, from cradle to grave, what constitutes worthiness, success, goodness, and lovability. Initially, in the tender years of our formation, the deviation from our authentic trajectory, our soul's true longing, is so minute, so fractional, as to be easily dismissed, rationalized away, or simply not perceived amidst the overwhelming task of navigating childhood and adolescence. A hesitant, barely audible yes, uttered from lips that trembled with an unvoiced no. A yes offered when the entirety of the soul, every cell and fiber, every instinct and intuition, resonated with a clear, unequivocal, earth-shattering, and truth-bearing nitrogen monoxide. A crucial, world-shaping silence maintained, a vital, life-altering word swallowed, a boundary unexpressed, when your innermost conviction, your most profound, intuitive insight, your deepest, most sacred truth, yearned with an almost physical, visceral ache for bold, clear, unapologetic articulation and embodiment. A life path, a career, a relationship, a belief system embarked upon not for its intrinsic joyful resonant alignment with the deepest currents of your unique spirit, your soul's blueprint, but chosen for the anticipated applause, the coveted approval, the desperately needed validation it might garner from the shadowy, ever-watchful, and deeply internalized gallery of unseen, often long-dead judges, parents, teachers, peers, society. Each such act, viewed in isolation, in the immediacy of the moment, might appear as a seemingly insignificant grain of sand, a minor necessary compromise in the grand, complex scheme of navigating a challenging world. Yet, over the relentless, unforgiving, and cumulative passage of lived time, these individual, seemingly inconsequential grains of self-abandonment amass, accumulating with silent, formidable, and crushing weight. They transform once fertile, vibrant, creatively rich inner landscapes into arid, desolate, life-starved deserts with a sacred wellspring of your own intuition, your direct line to divine guidance, struggles, and eventually, tragically, fails to find life-sustaining purchase, where its waters run dry or turn bitter. It is here that the authentic, untamed, powerful voice of your true, essential self becomes a parched, almost inaudible, desperate whisper, lost, drowned out, and ultimately silenced amidst the deafening, relentless cacophony of internalized expectations, fears, and conditioned shoulds. You evolve through this protracted, often lifelong process of external attunement and internal disownment into a veritable master cartographer, not, tragically and ironically, of your own rich, complex, multifaceted inner terrain, the terra incognita of your own soul, but of the convoluted, ever-shifting, often treacherous topographies of other people's emotional landscapes, their spoken desires, their unexpressed needs, and, more powerfully and insidiously, their unconscious, often projected, anxieties and expectations. You become a fluent, almost preternaturally gifted, and often highly praised translator of societal scripts, of familial blueprints, of cultural mandates, of unspoken relational contracts, effortlessly, almost psychically, anticipating the desires, the moods, the anxieties, and the potential rejections of those whose validation, approval, and love you have unconsciously, and with devastating consequence, come to equate with your very survival, your right to exist. Yet in this outward-facing, often exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable virtuosity of pleasing, performing, and perfecting, you have become profoundly, devastatingly deaf to the mother tongue of your own heart, a lyrical, symbolic, deeply embodied, and utterly unique language you once knew with the seamless intimacy of your own breath, a language spoken in feelings, in images, in sensations, in intuitive hits, in dreams. The profound soul-level tragedy, the crux of this human dilemma, is not merely that you became irretrievably lost in this intricate, demanding, an ultimately unfulfilling dance of external attunement and relentless self-monitoring. It is that you are subtly, systematically, and with devastating, lifelong effectiveness convinced, often by those who themselves were similarly conditioned, similarly lost, and acting from their own unhealed wounds, that the borrowed map, the handed-down, often toxic narrative, the culturally sanctioned, fear-based script, was your own divinely ordained, unalterable, and only available path. And then one fateful day, perhaps in a moment of uncharacteristic, unearned, and grace-filled stillness, a sudden unexpected shaft of piercing light that miraculously penetrates the dense, habitual fog of ordinary unexamined doing, or conversely, and perhaps more commonly, through a personal crisis, so profound, so earth-shattering, so utterly destabilizing, that it completely, irrevocably demolishes the meticulously constructed, yet ultimately fragile and illusory, edifice of your controlled, predictable, and consensus-approved existence. A devastating loss, a painful betrayal, a life-threatening illness, a dark night of the soul. In that moment of stark, terrifying clarity, you look down at your own trembling, empty hands, and you realize with a clarity so chilling, so visceral, it freezes the very marrow in your bones and stops your breath, that you have been navigating the vast, tempestuous, and sacred ocean of your one precious, unrepeatable human life with a compass that was never truly, authentically, divinely yours. You awaken to the horror of steering a magnificent, outwardly impressive, and culturally lauded vessel that, for all its accumulated glory, its external accolades, and its apparent seaworthiness, was never genuinely, deeply, or joyfully aligned with the sacred, immutable, and life-giving currents of your innermost being, your soul's true purpose, your authentic destiny. The silence that descends, or rather erupts, in the immediate, disorienting, and often terrifying wake of this stark, undeniable, and world-altering realization is of a profoundly different timbre, a distinct and unsettling vibrational frequency than any silence encountered or cultivated before. It is not the serene, expansive, pregnant void that can sometimes follow a genuine spiritual awakening, an emptiness that is not empty, but rather brimming with nascent potential, unmanifest possibility, and the peaceful stillness of pure awareness. Instead, the silence that ensues from the collapse of the false self is often deafening, echoing, almost unbearable in its intensity. It is the silence that follows the sudden, brutal recognition of a profound, deeply lodged, chronically ignored, and now fully conscious internal dissonance. A cacophony of unspoken truths, unlived lives, and ungrieved losses. A vast, terrifying chasm previously unseen, unacknowledged, or willfully ignored through myriad defense mechanisms and distractions now yawns with formidable, unavoidable, and terrifying presence between the life you are so diligently, exhaustingly, and performatively living and the vibrant, authentic, unlived life that has been patiently, achingly, and often despairingly waiting, perhaps for decades, perhaps for an entire lifetime, within the deepest, most sacred recesses of your soul, like a forgotten prisoner in a dungeon of your own making. And the question, the primal scream that surfaces from these turbulent, uncharted, and newly disturbed depths is no longer the poignant, somewhat detached, philosophical lament of, "Why do I feel so empty now that I finally perceive the truth of illusion?" But rather, the soul-searing, existentially critical, and deeply personal inquiry. How did I, step by almost invisible, self-negating, soul-denying step, wander so catastrophically, so tragically, so completely far from the sacred, hallowed, life-giving ground of my own authentic, God-given self? And who, in absolute, unvarnished, terrifying truth, is this abandoned self, this forgotten exile residing within the very walls of my own skin, this shadow child whose persistent, courageous, life-affirming whispers, please, and warnings I have for so long, and with such dire, far-reaching, and heartbreaking consequence, systematically ignored, suppressed, rationalized away, and actively denied? This is not merely a cognitive inquiry. It is a full-body, cellular-level reckoning, a spiritual emergency that demands not an answer, but a transformation. This, then, is the subtle, protracted, and often entirely unrecognized crucifixion of the authentic human spirit. A slow bleeding of life force, a gradual dimming of the inner light. It is not a dramatic, public martyrdom inflicted by overt, easily identifiable external oppressors, though such forces undoubtedly exist and contribute to the wounding of humanity. Rather, what we speak of here is a more insidious, more intimate, and arguably more pervasive form of soul suffering. A slow, agonizing, internal erosion of self-trust, self-respect, self-love, and self-knowledge, orchestrated by the countless accumulated and often deeply unconscious micro-betrayals of our own innate, embodied wisdom, our intuitive guidance, our deepest values, and our soul's true desires. We are indoctrinated from our earliest, most vulnerable, and most impressionable days by our families, by our educational systems, by our cultures, by our religious institutions, which can sometimes instill fear and dogma, rather than fostering direct spiritual experience and unconditional love, to seek our reflection, our validation, our very sense of intrinsic worth and conditional lovability in the often distorted, biased, conditional, and relentlessly unreliable mirrors of other people's eyes. In the fleeting, ephemeral, and performance-based approval of a world that frequently, if not predominantly, rewards conformity, compliance, assimilation, and the suppression of inconvenient individuality over the courageous, often disruptive, and world-changing expression of authentic selfhood. But what if one dares to ask, breaking the hypnotic spell of generations of conditioning, the most sacred, most truth-telling, most reliably accurate, and most loving mirror is not, and can never be, found out there in the fickle, ever-changing gaze of the other, in the chaotic marketplace of public opinion, or in the attainment of external symbols of validation? What if, instead, this true mirror is the one meticulously, lovingly, and eternally held within the soul's quiet, inviolate, and ever-present chamber, reflecting not a constructed image, but the timeless essence of our being? What if the ultimate, most essential, and most rewarding pilgrimage is not towards distant, exotic lands, not towards achieving spiritual fireworks or esoteric cosmic insights, not towards accumulating external badges of enlightenment or worldly success, but rather consists of the painstaking, often unglamorous, profoundly courageous, deeply humbling, and ultimately sacred work of reclaiming the absolute, unquestionable sovereign authority of your own innate, embodied, and unerring inner knowing. Your direct connection to the divine, your birthright as a unique emanation of Source? Consider for a moment, with eyes wide open to its subtle and overt manifestations, the insidious, pervasive, and deeply damaging phenomenon of gaslighting, not necessarily or solely enacted by a singular, consciously manipulative, narcissistic individual, but rather woven with deceptive, almost invisible, subtlety into the very fabric, the warp and weft of a dominant culture that systematically, if often unconsciously and with ostensibly good intentions, undermines, devalues, pathologizes, and actively discourages the profound validity, wisdom, and guidance of direct subjective inner experience. You're being far too sensitive. You need to toughen up, grow a thicker skin. That's simply not how the real world operates. You're being idealistic, naive, unrealistic. You should just be grateful for what you have. Don't rock the boat. Don't ask for more. Don't be difficult. It's all in your head. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. These are not merely casual, innocuous dismissals or well-intentioned, if misguided, advice. They are the subtle, persistent, culturally sanctioned, and deeply internalized whispers, the linguistic viruses that coax us, generation after generation, with devastating, soul-crushing effectiveness, to sever the vital, life-giving, umbilical connection with our internal guidance system, our intuitive wisdom, our moral compass, our authentic feelings. Slowly, insidiously, often beginning in earliest childhood, we begin to doubt the clarity of our own perceptions, to question the inherent validity of our deepest, most resonant feelings, to override the insistent, life-saving wisdom of our gut reactions and bodily sensations, to silence the quiet, persistent, often life-saving and divinely sourced voice that has, in truth, always known the way, always whispered the next right step, always warned us of danger, always guided us towards wholeness. This pervasive cultural tendency, this collective hypnosis, is not indicative of a grand, orchestrated, malevolent conspiracy enacted by a shadowy cabal. It is perhaps more accurately understood as the collective inherited and unconsciously perpetuated fear-based hypnosis of a world fundamentally, if unconsciously terrified, of the untamed, unpredictable, creatively potent, intensely passionate, and profoundly powerful wilderness that resides often dormant, but never fully extinguishable within each individual human soul. It is a systemic fear of the very life force itself, a fear that, if this force were truly unleashed, acknowledged, and honored, would inevitably challenge the existing status quo, dismantle oppressive illusions, and usher in a new paradigm of being based on truth, love, and interconnectedness. The journey back to this forsaken, often feared, yet ultimately sacred inner wilderness, the journey of reclaiming the disowned self, is rarely, if ever, a direct, linear, predictable, upward ascent towards a predefined, culturally sanctioned summit of spiritual perfection or psychological integration. It is far more accurately a spiral dance, a cyclical, iterative process of descent and ascent, of shedding and reclaiming, of dying and rebirthing. It is a courageous, often messy, profoundly challenging, and ultimately transformative descent into the shadowed, forgotten, and often feared landscapes of the unconscious self, the repository of all that has been denied, repressed, and disowned. It demands an uncommon, almost countercultural, and fiercely sustained courage, the courage to sit unflinchingly, open-heartedly, and without judgment, with the profound, often agonizing, and deeply uncomfortable weight of your own past choices, their inescapable consequences, and the cumulative pain of your self-abandonment, not in the harsh, unforgiving, and self-flagellating glare of shame, guilt, and relentless self-recrimination, but bathed, instead, in the warm, unwavering, unconditional, and fiercely tender light of radical, revolutionary self-compassion and acceptance. It means painstakingly, patiently, and with unwavering devotional intent, relearning, as if for the first time, how to truly, deeply listen, not to the deafening, incessant, and often contradictory clamor and endless demands of the external world, nor to the tyrannical, punitive, and relentlessly critical voice of the internalized inner critic, but rather to the subtle, nuanced, often symbolic, and deeply embodied currents, the almost imperceptible ebbs and flows, the quiet sighs and nascent stirrings, the somatic wisdom and intuitive urgings of your own unique sacred and divinely connected being. This profound, life-altering act of reclamation, of coming home to oneself, is not, and can never be, about discovering a new, charismatic guru to follow blindly, adopting yet another restrictive, externally imposed dogma or belief system, or mastering the latest, trendiest, quick-fix external system of salvation, self-help, or spiritual enlightenment. It is, at its very core, about undertaking the sacred, deeply personal, and often solitary archaeological dig of the self. It is about reverently, courageously, and with unwavering commitment excavating the timeless, unshakable, inherent, and God-given wisdom, the buried treasure of your authentic nature that has been tragically, systematically buried alive often for decades, beneath layers upon layers of suffocating societal conditioning, limiting familial expectations, internalized oppression and prejudice, and deeply ingrained self-imposed fear-based limitations and defense mechanisms. It is about unearthing the diamond of your true self from beneath the rubble of your conditioned personality. This arduous yet ultimately liberating and joyful path of return of unbecoming. Everything that is not truly, you often feel shrouded, particularly in its initial and middle stages, in a profound, almost unbearable, and existentially resonant sense of loneliness, of being utterly adrift, misunderstood, and disconnected from the familiar world. For in consciously, deliberately, and courageously choosing this path, less traveled you are. By necessity, consciously, deliberately, and often painfully stepping away from the familiar, hypnotic, and often deceptively comforting chorus of conformity, from the well-trodden, consensus-approved paths of collective agreement and social validation. The old, externalized, and culturally sanctioned metrics of success, achievement, status, and validation, which once held such potent, irresistible, and often coercive allure, begin to lose their gravitational pull, their hypnotic power to compel, control, and define you. The approval, acceptance, and admiration you once craved with such desperate, almost childlike intensity, the attainment of which often dictated your major life choices, now begins to feel like a beautifully gilded, yet ultimately suffocating spiritual and psychological cage, a prison of your own and society's making. You begin tentatively and with much trepidation and inner conflict at first, then with growing embodied conviction and a nascent sense of inner rightness, to choose the unsettling, sometimes terrifying, yet deeply resonant and profoundly authentic peace of inner alignment over the comfortable, predictable, yet soul-deadening, and ultimately illusory validation offered by the tribe, the collective, the family system, or the societal status quo. This is the very essence, the beating heart of the sacred rebellion, not a noisy, externalized, reactive, and often ego-driven, defiant uprising against other people, institutions, or external authorities, but rather a quiet, courageous, deeply internal, and profoundly transformative revolution against those deeply ingrained, often unconsciously held, and powerfully defended parts of yourself that learned, long ago, often in response to trauma or unbearable emotional pain, as a matter of perceived psychological or even physical survival, to betray, abandon, and silence your inviolable, sacred truth in exchange for a counterfeit, conditional, fragile, and ultimately unsustainable sense of belonging, safety, or love. It is the choice to belong, first and foremost, to yourself, to your soul, to God, even if it means risking the loss of external affiliations that are not resonant with your deepest truth. The insightful, pioneering, and often controversial psychoanalyst Alice Miller, in her groundbreaking work, spoke with profound, often unsettling, and deeply compassionate clarity about the drama of the gifted child. A child gifted not necessarily or exclusively in the conventional societal sense of possessing extraordinary, measurable talents, prodigious intellectual abilities, or exceptional artistic skills, but rather a child endowed, often from their very earliest moments of consciousness, with an acute, almost painfully heightened, and exquisitely attuned sensitivity to the unspoken emotional needs, the subtle desires, the unexpressed anxieties, the hidden agendas, and the often contradictory, double-binding expectations of their primary caregivers and their surrounding familial and social environment. Such children, with an almost preternatural, survival-driven intuition, intuitively learn, with astonishing rapidity and precision, to adapt, to perform, to chameleonically morph, and become whatever is perceived as needed, desired, or least threatening by those upon whom their physical and emotional survival utterly depends. They become experts at reading the emotional weather, at anticipating needs before they are expressed, at suppressing their own authentic feelings and desires if they sense these might cause displeasure, disapproval, or most terrifyingly, abandonment. They engage in a desperate, unconscious, and often lifelong bid to secure a precarious sense of love, safety, connection, and conditional worth. Many of us, as seemingly functional, capable, and well-adjusted adults, carry this vigilant, hyper-adaptive, often chronically anxious, and deeply exhausted inner child within our psyches, still unconsciously compulsively and tirelessly performing still, seamlessly adapting to the perceived expectations of others, still perpetually scanning the relational environment for subtle cues of approval or disapproval, acceptance or rejection. This inner child remains terrified at a primal, pre-verbal level that the raw, unvarnished, unmediated, and vulnerable truth of our authentic, unarmored self, with all its imperfections, its needs, its passions, its intensity, its messiness, might lead to the ultimate, unthinkable, and existentially annihilating catastrophe: utter rejection, complete ostracism, unbearable shame, and final, irrevocable abandonment. Healing this primal foundational wound, this deep rupture in our capacity for self-love and self-trust, is not, and can never be, about casting blame upon the imperfect, often wounded, and unconsciously acting individuals of our past, or their actions, however painful or damaging they may have been. For they too were often victims of similar, or worse, conditioning. Rather, healing lies in the sacred, ongoing, moment-to-moment, and deeply compassionate act of consciously, lovingly, and patiently reparenting that precious, often terrified, deeply misunderstood, and chronically neglected inner child now, in the safety and awareness of our adult present. It is about tenderly, consistently, and patiently assuring that vulnerable, wounded part of our psyche that its true, unedited, unfiltered, and authentic self, with all its feelings, needs, desires, and unique expressions, is not only acceptable, not only tolerable, but utterly essential, deeply lovable, inherently worthy, and profoundly needed in its unique, unrepeatable wholeness for our own healing, and by extension, for the healing of the world. It is about creating a secure inner attachment where once there was profound insecurity. What if one dares to imagine opening to a radically different paradigm of human motivation, the drive or purpose that gradually, tentatively, almost shyly, and with a quality of quiet humility, begins to re-emerge from the fertile, often tear-soaked soil of this deep, challenging, and transformative inner work, is not the familiar, culturally lauded, frenetic, anxiety-driven, and often ego-aggrandizing roaring fire of ambition. An ambition fueled, more often than not, by a gnawing, pervasive sense of lack, an underlying feeling of inadequacy, a desperate, insatiable need to prove one's worth, to achieve external validation, or to escape inner emptiness. What if, instead, this nascent, reawakening impulse is something far more profound, far more sustainable, and far more aligned with the true nature of the soul? What if it is a quiet, unwavering, deeply resonant, and profoundly empowering commitment to unwavering, uncompromising, moment-to-moment integrity? To live, breathe, choose, and act in steadfast, uncompromising, and joyful alignment with that painstakingly rediscovered, diligently recalibrated, and now fiercely protected inner compass, the voice of the soul, the wisdom of the heart, the guidance of the divine. Even when, and perhaps most especially when, that inner guidance points you towards uncharted, intimidating, socially unconventional, professionally risky, relationally challenging, and potentially lonely waters, paths that diverge sharply from the well-worn highways of collective expectation. This is a motivation born not from a desperate, insatiable hunger to achieve, to conquer, to accumulate, or to impress, but from a serene, unshakable, and quietly radiant fullness of being from a deeply embodied place of intrinsic sufficiency, inherent worthiness, and radical self-acceptance. It is a motivation that arises not from the gnawing, corrosive, and paralyzing anxiety of fear, the pervasive fear of failure, the immobilizing fear of judgment, the terrifying fear of criticism, the existential fear of annihilation or non-existence, but rather from a deep, abiding, resonant, and unconditional love for the simple, unadorned, often paradoxical, yet utterly sacred and undeniable truth of who you are at your very core, beneath all the layers of carefully constructed personality, societal conditioning, and fear-based defenses. It is a motivation to express, not to impress, to contribute, not to compete, to create, not to consume mindlessly, to love, not to control or possess. This courageous, often solitary, and profoundly sacred journey of unbecoming everything that is not truly you in order to consciously, lovingly, and powerfully become who you are always divinely meant to be is not, as a superficial or defensive world might hastily judge it, a regression into childish self-centeredness, narcissistic navel-gazing, or an irresponsible shirking of societal duties. It is, in fact, a profound, mature, and essential act of spiritual reclamation, of sacred soul retrieval, of embodying one's fullest human and divine potential. It is not a luxurious, optional, and self-indulgent pastime, available only to a privileged, leisured few, as a productivity-obsessed, materialistically driven culture might seek to dismiss it. It is, rather, the fundamental, non-negotiable, and deeply sacred labor of tending to one's own soul, a primary responsibility that, when undertaken with sincerity and commitment, ultimately benefits not only the individual in their journey towards wholeness, peace, and joy, but also reverberates outwards, contributing to the healing, transformation, and evolution of the entire collective, the human family, and indeed, the planet itself. For as each individual reclaims their authentic light, the overall illumination of the world intensifies. The external world, still largely operating from, and deeply invested in, the old, often dysfunctional, and rapidly crumbling paradigms of conditional worth, external validation, patriarchal power structures, and competitive individualism, may not understand, nor readily approve of, your profound inner transformation and its outward manifestations. It may, with predictable defensiveness, born of its own unexamined fears and insecurities, misinterpret your necessary periods of withdrawal, introspection, and solitude as failure, depression, social inadequacy, or even madness. It may misconstrue your newfound contemplative silence, your deliberate disengagement from meaningless drama and superficial distractions, and your refusal to participate in soul-draining activities as apathy, detachment, aloofness, or a lack of ambition. It may perceive your burgeoning, hard-won discernment, your clear articulation of needs, and your consistent setting of healthy, self-honoring boundaries as harsh judgment, unforgiving rigidity, selfishness, or an unwillingness to be a team player. But within that carefully cultivated, fiercely protected, and increasingly resilient sacred inner space that you are diligently, lovingly, and courageously nurturing within your own being, a space of self-awareness, self-compassion, and unwavering self-trust, something ancient, wise, incredibly powerful, profoundly beautiful, and deeply authentic is stirring, reawakening, and gathering irresistible momentum and strength. The intuitive faculties, long suppressed, ignored, or actively discredited by a hyper-rationalistic culture, begin to sharpen, clarify, and become astonishingly reliable and precise. The instinctual wisdom of the body, dismissed as primitive, untrustworthy, or irrelevant by a mind-obsessed civilization, reclaims its rightful, honored place as a primary source of guidance, information, and healing. The part of you that knows with an undeniable embodied, cellular certainty that transcends mere logic, intellectual understanding, empirical proof, or external validation is slowly, surely, and irrevocably coming back online, reclaiming its sovereign, rightful seat at the round table council of your integrated being. This is the emergence of the self, the indwelling divine, the authentic presence. This arduous, yet profoundly rewarding, ultimately liberating, and deeply sacred journey doesn't magically, instantly transport you to a utopian fairy tale life entirely devoid of pain, challenge, loss, disappointment, or sorrow. Those are indelible, intrinsic, and often profoundly growth-inducing and character-building textures of the shared human experience, the curriculum of Earth School. However, what this journey of radical self-reclamation does, progressively, demonstrably, and with increasing consistency lead you towards, is a life increasingly remarkably free from the particular insidious self-inflicted and soul-crushing agony of chronic self-betrayal, from the exhausting, debilitating internal warfare of living a divided, fragmented, and inauthentic life. The vast, previously immeasurable and chronically depleted reserves of precious psychic and physical life, energy that was once relentlessly, unconsciously, and compulsively consumed in the exhausting full-time and ultimately futile job of maintaining the elaborate, fragile, and burdensome facade of the false self, in constantly managing the internal conflict and cognitive dissonance between the true self and the performed self, in perpetually attempting to quiet, numb, or distract from the persistent, nagging, and deeply uncomfortable inner dissonance that signals a life lived off course, are now miraculously, through the alchemy of self-awareness and self-love, liberated, reclaimed, and made available for more authentic, creative, joyful, and life-affirming pursuits. And this liberated, reclaimed, and purified psychic energy, this revitalized and potent life force, this elan vital, becomes the clean, sustainable, resonant, and divinely sourced fuel for a life lived finally, authentically, courageously, and joyfully from the deepest, most sacred wellspring of the inside out. Such a life may not, and indeed often does not, resemble the conventional, culturally sanctioned and externally validated portraits of success, power, happiness, or spiritual attainment that the world tirelessly, often deceptively, and with considerable pressure champions and promotes. But it feels like home. It resonates with an irrefutable, undeniable, and deeply satisfying chord of profound, resonant truth, of inner peace, of quiet joy. It tastes profoundly and unmistakably like genuine, hard-won, and non-negotiable freedom. It smells like the clean, pure, invigorating air after a long, cleansing, and transformative rainstorm that has washed away decades of accumulated dust and debris from the soul. It is the palpable experience of alignment, of congruence, of wholeness, of being fully, unapologetically, and radiantly alive. So if you find yourself in this present sacred moment of your unfolding life, standing within that quiet, often unsettling, profoundly liminal and creatively potent space, the transitional space between a life, a role, and identity that no longer fits, that has become too small, too constricting, too painful, and a new life, a truer expression of self that is not yet fully formed, not yet clearly visible, not yet wholly manifested, and if you are beginning to recognize with increasing uncomfortable, yet ultimately liberating clarity, the discordant, painful, and soul-wearying echoes of a life lived even slightly, yet significantly and consequentially, off-key from your soul's true, unique, divinely orchestrated, and sacred song, please know this with the deepest, most unwavering certainty your heart can possibly muster. This dawning recognition, this painful awareness, this existential discomfort is not an ending. It is not a sign of your inherent failure, your irredeemable inadequacy, your fundamental brokenness, or a judgment upon your past choices. It is, in fact, on the contrary, a profound, sacred, timely, and grace-filled invitation. An invitation, perhaps the most important, most pivotal, and most life-altering you will ever receive in this entire incarnation, to undertake the most courageous, most meaningful, most challenging, and ultimately most rewarding journey of your entire human life. The sacred journey to come home, fully, completely, unconditionally, and unapologetically, to your true, authentic, essential, and divine self. This sacred pilgrimage of return, this homecoming to the soul, is not characterized as popular spiritual fantasies might suggest by grand, dramatic, instantaneous, and effortless pronouncements, nor by sudden magical Hollywood-style transformations that require no inner work, no sacrifice, no discomfort. Rather, it is defined, and its success is measured by a long, patient, often challenging, sometimes faltering, yet always forward-moving succession of small, consistent, yet profoundly courageous and deeply significant acts of unwavering self-fidelity, of choosing yourself, your truth, your soul, again and again and again, in the face of internal resistance and external pressure. It involves learning, with painstaking patience, humility, and dedication, as if for the very first time, to truly, deeply, and reverently trust that subtle, often fleeting, yet incredibly wise, divinely guided flicker of yes or no, of expansion or contraction, of resonance or dissonance, that arises from the deepest recesses of your gut, your heart, your somatic intelligence, your intuitive knowing. It requires finding, cultivating, nurturing, and repeatedly, courageously exercising the strength to speak your authentic, vulnerable, and often inconvenient truth, even and most especially when your voice trembles, your palms sweat, your heart pounds, and your knees threaten to buckle beneath you from the weight of conditioned fear and anticipated disapproval. It necessitates choosing, with conscious, deliberate, and unwavering intent, again and again, day after day, moment after sacred moment, what genuinely, deeply, and uniquely nourishes your soul. What makes your authentic spirit sing with joy? What brings you into alignment with your deepest values and your highest purpose, even and most, especially when those choices make absolutely no logical sense to anyone else in your immediate orbit, or indeed to the conditioned critical and fear-based parts of your own thoroughly programmed mind. This is the slow, deliberate, often unglamorous, sometimes frustrating, yet deeply sacred and profoundly alchemical art of meticulously, patiently, and lovingly rebuilding an unbreakable, unconditional, and joyfully resilient trust with the most significant, most enduring, most influential, and ultimately most intimate relationship you will ever have in this or any lifetime. The sacred relationship you consciously, actively cultivate with your own true, authentic, sovereign, and divine self. And from that unshakable, resilient, and deeply rooted foundation of profound inner integrity, of radical, compassionate self-acceptance, of unwavering, courageous self-trust, and of unconditional self-love, a life of profound, authentic, uniquely personal, and deeply fulfilling meaning. A meaning not imposed from without by cultural decree, societal expectation, religious dogma, or external authority, but organically, uniquely, and joyfully discovered, created, and cultivated from within the fertile depths of your own awakened being, can, at long, blessed last, begin to truly, magnificently, powerfully, and unapologetically blossom into its fullest, most vibrant, most creative, and most divinely intended expression. The world, in its current state of profound imbalance, widespread disconnection, pervasive fear, and ecological crisis, does not urgently need more individuals who have perfected, at great personal cost, the exhausting, soul-diminishing, and ultimately futile art of pleasing others, of conforming to external expectations, of betraying their own truth, at the catastrophic expense of their own well-being, their own vitality, their own unique genius, and their own sacred truth. What this beautiful, wounded, and rapidly transforming world desperately, urgently needs, now more than ever before, in the complex tapestry of human history, are more courageous, awakened, and embodied souls. Individuals who have painstakingly, patiently, and lovingly mastered the quiet, radical, world-changing courage to simply, authentically, unapologetically, compassionately, and joyfully be themselves, in all their imperfect, messy, radiant, multifaceted, and unique glory. For in that authentic, embodied expression of individual wholeness lies the potent, irrepressible seed of collective healing, planetary transformation, and the co-creation of a more conscious, just, loving, and sustainable future for all beings. Your authentic presence is your greatest gift, your most powerful activism, your most sacred offering. If something within this exceptionally extensive and deeply layered exploration has stirred a significant, resonance within the deepest chambers of your being, if even a single phrase, concept, or image has mirrored a hidden, perhaps long forgotten, or unacknowledged corner of your own precious and unique inner experience. I warmly, respectfully, and wholeheartedly invite you to share your reflections, your questions, your insights, your challenges, and your personal stories in the comments section below, should you feel so moved. Have you keenly, perhaps painfully, felt the subtle or not so subtle and often agonizing drift from your own authentic North Star, the core of your being? Or are you, perhaps, currently, courageously navigating the challenging, often bewildering, disorienting, yet ultimately rewarding and liberating terrain of the sacred path back to your own innate, sovereign, and divinely connected knowing? Your personal story, however unfinished, imperfect, or fragmented it may feel to you right now, could unknowingly, even anonymously, become the very beacon of resonant light, the unexpected permission slip for authenticity, the comforting hand of solidarity that another fellow traveler navigating their own particular darkness, confusion, or despair has been desperately, if unconsciously, searching for. Your vulnerability can be a profound act of service. And if someone significant in your life, a cherished friend, a beloved family member, a respected colleague, or even an acquaintance whose quiet struggle you have intuitively sensed, seems to be wrestling with the invisible, yet formidable and often crushing, chains of external expectation, societal pressure, or internalized oppression. If they appear to be systematically, tragically, and perhaps unconsciously dimming their own unique, brilliant, and desperately needed light in a painful, valiant, yet ultimately futile attempt to fit into spaces, roles, or relationships far too small, too confining, and too soul-denying for the true, expansive magnitude of their beautiful spirit, consider if and when it feels genuinely appropriate, resonant, and safe to do so, sharing this extended reflection with them as a gentle, offering a potential catalyst or a source of solace and understanding. Let us together, in compassionate community and mutual support, gently, persistently, and courageously help each other remember, and more importantly, embody the profound, life-altering truth that the most vital, most reliable, and most loving compass for navigating the complexities and paradoxes of this precious human life lies unwavering, ever-present, and divinely encoded within each of us. That true, authentic, soul-nourishing belonging never, ever demands the devastating, life-negating sacrifice of the soul, the betrayal of one's core truth, and that the quiet, consistent, moment-to-moment, and often fiercely courageous act of choosing to be oneself in all one's multifaceted, authentic complexity is perhaps the greatest, most healing, most empowering, and most revolutionary gift we can possibly offer to ourselves, to each other, and to a world so desperately, achingly in need of genuine presence, authentic connection, and embodied truth. Before you continue on your unique, sacred, and ever-unfolding path, I extend a heartfelt and sincere invitation to subscribe to this space, this ongoing exploration, and perhaps to activate the notification bell if you feel so inclined and wish to be alerted to future deep dives into the human condition. Here, we collectively, and with mutual respect, endeavor to delve into these deeper, often overlooked, yet vitally important currents of human experience. We aim to explore, with honesty and vulnerability, the intricate, subtle, and often challenging architecture of the inner world, to learn to decipher the nuanced, symbolic, and profoundly wise whispers of intuition, and to support each other with compassion and encouragement in the ongoing, lifelong, and deeply transformative power of courageously, patiently, and lovingly coming home to who we truly, irrevocably, and magnificently are. If there is a particular aspect of this vast and profound journey of self-reclamation, a specific challenge you are currently facing, a nascent, exciting insight that is dawning within you, or a deeply held, perhaps ancient wound that is calling for gentle, respectful, and transformative exploration, Please do not hesitate to let your voice, your needs, your questions, and your unique wisdom be heard and shared. This communal space, this shared journey, is immeasurably enriched, enlivened, and made more whole, more resonant, and more impactful by your unique presence, your thoughtful, heartfelt engagement, and your courageous willingness to explore these vital, often daunting, yet ultimately life-altering questions together. Thank you, not only for dedicating your precious, irreplaceable time and your focused, receptive attention to this exceptionally extended reflection, but more importantly, and with deepest gratitude, for your unwavering commitment, however faltering or imperfect it may sometimes feel, to the profound, essential, sacred, and often arduous inner work of your own becoming, of consciously, diligently remembering and courageously, joyfully reclaiming the magnificent, undeniable, and world-changing truth of who you truly, essentially, and divinely are. And always, always, in every moment, through every challenge, and with every breath, remember this foundational, life-affirming, and empowering truth. The more deeply, unconditionally, courageously, and joyfully you learn to trust, honor, and love yourself, the more clearly, consistently, powerfully, and magnificently you'll hear and be guided by the unique, irreplaceable, exquisitely beautiful, and divinely orchestrated music that only your soul, in its perfect uniqueness, came here to this earth at this precise time to play. Until we meet again on this shared path of awakening and becoming, may you walk in ever-deepening, ever-expanding truth, in unwavering, compassionate courage, and in profound, resilient, self-generated peace.